Hello, and welcome back to Crew Parley. This is the inverted version of the normal parlay we do here on this channel. Normally, you all submit a prompt and then I respond to it. This time, I submitted the prompt and you all responded. My prompt this time was one key change to fix them all game designs. It doesn't really work. I said recall times where you could almost do something in a game, but there was just one key thing missing, preventing you from doing that. Or maybe you recall a situation where such a thing was added, a relatively small change, made a game different or capable of being different by a lot. This might be a good or bad change, or a subjective mix of both. A common example of a bad change like this would be a single new build option massively power creeping a game and messing with its balance / opportunity cost. If the change is just something you imagine, it doesn't have to be realistic. It could be that you'd probably have to mod it in because the devs likely wouldn't do it, or perhaps it totally could happen, but it just doesn't seem likely anytime soon. I think I explained this one a little badly. As always with me, the problem is these are often very abstract concepts. But I think that it's usually better to let the exact definition or intent of my question fall by the wayside a little bit because I don't really care, and instead to be open to a variety of interpretations of it and see what kind of versions of the prompt I get. Sure, it would be cool in its own way to get a bunch of things that are more exactly the version of it I have in mind, but I think it's just as fun and probably more effective at getting you all to think of stuff to leave it more open-ended. I do, however, want to explain a little bit more what I had in mind, and then you all had some different approaches to it, which I think are equally interesting, valuable. I just think some example is beneficial, and I have examples, uncommon for me, pretty good examples about this subject, because this is kind of a pet frustration of mine. A concept that I want to cover before we get into other people's responses is that this will tend to be true or noticeable of pretty good games, I think. And the reason for that, in my mind, is pretty simple. It's that when a game is otherwise pretty good, you both notice a little shortcoming more, and if it were changed, you would unlock more goodness. That is, if a piece of the game's design in a game that is otherwise pretty good is sort of holding it back, it's easier to notice the rest of the game isn't like that, and if you got it out of the way, it was holding back good game design. Whereas if the game is otherwise poor, yeah, there might be a little change you would make that would improve the game a lot, but it doesn't improve as good of a game, basically. And so I think it's both more noticeable and more beneficial with games that are otherwise pretty strong, because you're sort of unlocking something that was held back before. I think what I wrote kind of evokes that idea, but I did want to give a practical example. In Monster Hunter Wilds, this is the example that's been on my mind recently, they have this really interesting gameplay loop thing when you go out to hunt the monster, where you get on your mount, your sacred, and you can hit a button that will auto path you to the monster. Your sacred will auto run you to the monster. And while you're doing this, auto running to the monster on your mount, you could like go get a drink of water, take a piss or something. Or you have the ability to use your slinger, kind of a item-only grappling hook, if you haven't played Monster Hunter, to gather in the open world while auto running to the monster. I didn't know I wanted drive-by open world gathering. Why? But it's cool. Monster Hunter has lots of items in the open world that are, you consume them immediately for a benefit, or you keep them in your inventory and you could use them during the hunt, maybe a buff mushroom or something, or that are just crafting materials for later, somewhere in between. And gathering these while actively on the way to the monster, like without you needing to do anything else, you're autopathing there. It's fun. You get this kind of relaxed, very time efficient open world gathering, but it's also not really tense, but there is that feeling like you're moving by items. So you do have a kind of on rails shooter, again, kind of drive-by gathering thing happening. It's an interesting part of the gameplay loop, and I think it results in a game where you can have the feeling of gathering in an open world while setting aside almost no time to actually do that, which I think is a very compelling thing for a game where you might fight a boss for 30 minutes. That being said, because of that innovation, there's more pressure put on the menuing of the game. in a game where you're going to fight a boss for maybe 30 minutes, yeah, at the beginning, you'll go into your tent and reset your items, get anything you want to help you for the hunt, like traps or potions for healing or whatever. You'll eat a steak and get the sexy glamour shot of you eating a steak covered in cheese and honey, and, you know, maybe change your build and your appearance and stuff. But the menus for doing that stuff you do more or less every single time you ever do anything in Monster Hunter Wilds, are pretty clunky. And that is more noticeable to me than in a previous Monster Hunter game I've played, because the rest of the gameplay loop is now quite frictionless, in my opinion. It would now unlock that frictionless experience if the menus were cleaned up a little bit. And I always hate to be harsh about this. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be mean, but I don't think it's that hard to make menus less clunky. I think you can just look over the shoulder of a player using them and go, wow, every single time the player ever does anything in this game, they'll want to go back into their tent, click the loadout button for their inventory to put away the stuff they gathered and get a new set of stuff they want to use. That action is perhaps the most basic thing that you ever do in Monster Hunter Wilds. That action should be easy to do. That should not be buried in a menu. That should not be a few clicks into a menu. Arguably, that ought to be automatic when you enter your tent. I don't really see why it can't be. And then if you needed it to not be, then you could always switch something on or off or whatever. Let alone what it is, which is buried in a few different menus. Many people playing Monster Hunter Wilds probably don't even know that there's a system to kind of auto, you know, with one click anyway. Well, it's with like 3 clicks, but that's my point. Once you get to the right place, 1 click, swap out your inventory for a new one. That little change, it might seem like a nitpick, but understand that what might seem like the nitpicky nature of the change, what's the big deal? It's not a big deal. The rest of the game is good. Yeah, but why does it not have to just be a better version of it, though? That wouldn't be especially hard to do. Like, it's not like it would be so complicated to just make it be that it's 1 button press instead of like 4 or whatever. And it is a pretty important part of the game. Like, it's not a very game designerly argument to say, but it just isn't a big deal. As I increasingly often think I should just say at the beginning of pretty much every discussion when we discuss game design, if you're not annoyed by that, that's not bad, but you don't disagree with me that it is a good game design critique. You just don't personally consider it an issue for you, perhaps. That is not what we are discussing. It's not that for me it's a deal breaker for Monster Hunter Wilds. It isn't. I've played 200 hours of the damn thing. It's just that there isn't any reason it shouldn't just be better or different. And it would unlock a lot of potential smoothness, fun, flow in the game. I'm not saying that that means I'm automatically right either. I just invite you to keep in mind that this is a game design discussion. You don't have to agree that these things are like a problem for you. They're not a problem for me. But I do think that they are inferior and not very costly to change pieces of the game's design. And so why not change them? There are some reasons not to change them, but mostly it isn't a valid argument to say, well, I just don't think that's that big of a deal. It's like, okay, well, if it's not a very big deal, but it's very easy to fix, it sounds like the benefit is commensurate with the cost to make the change. So it ought to be changed. But this comes up a lot in discussions of game design on these channels of mine, so I think that's important to highlight. Anyway, also mostly to do the other people who responded a favor that you don't have to clarify that yourselves. You're going to make some very particular critiques of these games, and I do not think that those are nitpicky at all. I invite other people to consider that they're not. This is coming from a place of the game is good, and we want that goodness to be free and clearly available, not because we're trying to kneecap a game that we, I don't know, like don't like or something. I worry that people have just been in so many disingenuous arguments that kind of activates something. So just a reminder, this is coming from a place of affection for these games, wanting them to be as cool as they can be, and contemplating game design so that in the future we can think about that in more useful ways, apply it to games that we make ourselves, and potentially, I don't know, like there are sometimes game designers listening in on this stuff. Maybe it will end up being helpful to someone. It's certainly been helpful for me. Let's begin with Just Rusty, who says, I always remember the point in XCOM where I realized the game is balanced in such a way, at higher difficulties, that most of the defensive skills, smoke grenades, suppression, etc., are basically useless. Once you realize that cover removal, like destroying the things the enemies are hiding behind, and overwhelming firepower can end most fights before they even happen, like focus fire. You're basically playing an entirely different game once you realize that, because the way the game works is by activating individual pods of aliens once you see them. Flanking also becomes a bad tactic once you're very sure, unless you're very sure there's nothing else left on the map, as the risk of setting off a new pod of aliens far outstrips the benefits of flanking from around cover. That's not to say it isn't interesting and challenging, but never let the enemy fire a single round is a very different play experience to the take cover, find angles to flank dance, which happens when you're not aware of the mechanics of activating aliens going on behind the scenes. Great examples. So yeah, the idea is that if you're looking from above with your squad in XCOM, and in the fog of war, there's groups of enemies. At some area on the map, like a little blip on the terrain, there is an invisible trigger programmed by the developers that is, once you get this close to this squad of enemies, they will aggro to you. They'll come attack you, another part of the fight. If you're fighting a squad up here, and you flank them to get a good positional advantage from both sides, so they can't easily be behind cover, you know the many benefits of flanking in a tactical shooter. Well, flanking them to this side has maybe aggroed this pod of enemies over here. The benefit of the flank does not outweigh the detriment of you aggro an entire other group of enemies and flank yourself, probably resulting in you just dying, I would imagine. By comparison, again, the benefit of the flank might seem rather modest, and it sounds like it's made even more modest by the fact that there are ways to deal with the enemy being behind cover other than flanking, which are made more valuable by the danger of the flank. However, I think an important through line for this parlay is going to be that many players could easily play the game and not notice that. If you play XCOM, I don't, but if you play XCOM or this logic makes sense to you, you might be thinking, well, come on, like aggroing enemies is pretty obvious, right? How would people not notice that? But a lot of people don't think of games in terms of a machine made of code. It's kind of like the game. It's a bit more magic to some people. Having digested every single line of code of how games work and thinking about game design, it might be obvious to us, well, of course flanking will be like that, right? But a lot of players will just think, oh, flanking is part of the strategy and enemies were meant to aggro me here. To know that there is a way to avoid the enemies getting aggroed to them there, they would have to go replay the same level but not flank, or again have that outside the box abstract thinking about game design. Oh, maybe me flanking triggered the enemies aggroing to me. I know that seems kind of obvious to probably a lot of people listening to these parlay, but I think it's reasonable to consider that many players really, it doesn't occur to them that that is why that's happening. So two themes have come up already. One, which is that there is a kind of superposition with the game, where depending on whether you notice this, it may seem like that's just how the game is and that's rough, or you might realize, oh no, wait, if I just avoid flanking, then that kind of gets rid of that and the game will get much easier. Maybe you just decide not to flank and you notice that other enemies really don't aggro that much. You might not know that they would have aggroed if you had flanked. It could go the other way, right? So, and that combined with how that affects your experience. And this second through line, which is basically like that the game changes when you notice these things. So you said never let the enemy fire a single round is very different from take cover, find angles to flank dance kind of thing. Right, the sort of essence of the game changes if you realize this about the game's systems. And that's bad because you play a lot of the game and only after you've spent a lot of time with the game does the game reveal that it is actually sort of about something else and you sort of can't go back. I think that's the concern. You really can't undo the knowledge that you're aggroing other enemies this way. So the moment you realize this, XCOM is not the same game you signed up for at the beginning. You might like it more, but it isn't the same thing that you hopefully liked for the preceding hours of gameplay. Hopefully we can agree this is not ideal. Sure. Continuing, Just Rusty says, a lot of coverage of XCOM 2 discussed how the Overwatch creep from the first game wasn't entirely removed, but they took steps to tackle it. The pod manipulation problem never got solved. For all of the spin-off Chimera Squad's flaws, the fact that it's a series of fights in enclosed rooms did a lot to solve this problem of disincentivizing movement. Sure, but mostly by just deleting that complexity, right? You said its new initiative system brought in a whole new way that death is the best crowd control being a problem, and once again letting you avoid having the enemies fire in a different way, but that's probably for another parlay. Sure, I mean, I think it's a useful example though, in that to me as a layperson, causing the fights to be in an enclosed space doesn't seem like a good solution, in the sense that you basically just deleted the potential complexity from before. It didn't really solve the problem of you flanking and then aggroing a pod of enemies. They basically just deleted that type of gameplay from the game. And so I guess it's gone now. It seems to me like there would be a lot of knobs to balance the sort of breaching the enemy's cover situation. This one is interesting. For one key change, you might be thinking, audience, listener, not just Rusty, is this topic? Is this the same thing as what Zandy was talking about before? I think it is. I mean, the question here is, there's a lot of different versions of this gameplay loop that maybe had one little thing wrong. It's not like, what would you change to make it right? I mean, we don't know. Just Rusty and I don't know. We have noticed, definitely, there is this gameplay loop where there's kind of a balance issue, and if you were to address it in some solid way, that would open up a lot of the game's tactical combat. It seems to me like if you have an ability that just blows up a piece of cover, I'm imagining people locking down a position in the street, they've got a big concrete barrier thingy, you know what I mean, those things on the side of highways that an enemy's crouching behind. And you've got a couple of options to get the enemy out from behind cover. You can flank them, we talked about that, or you can use an ability that does something like fire a piercing round through the concrete, and the sci-fi technology thing will burrow in and then fire out a spray of fire or something on the other side, a little breacher round. Or just explode it off. You fire a grenade launcher at it, or an RPG, and you blow up the cover, you remove the cover. So at the moment, it sounds like that is overpowered because flanking has a lot of drawbacks, and so any tactic that is another way to deal with enemies being behind cover, by not having the drawbacks of flanking, is already made much stronger. If that is then a relatively equivalent tactic otherwise to flanking, then it's a little bit too strong. Once you figure this out, there's really no reason not to do that instead of flanking, which is bad. There shouldn't be choices if there isn't really a choice, I think, in terms of game design. So it seems to me like just making the breaching ability be on a longer cooldown or be harder to use in some... I'm not sure what design knobs exist in XCOM, but, you can use it from shorter range, and it's got a longer cooldown, or it's got a resource cost in some games meta progression, or it doesn't work on certain types of materials, or... I don't know, things like that. Maybe it's loud, and that could also aggro enemies from far away. That doesn't seem great, because then it feels sort of meaningless which tactic you use. Maybe making it more visible where enemies will aggro from is good. Something I've played around with a lot in Dungeons and Dragons is the stealth mechanics. I think it's very valuable for a stealthy experience or a tactical breaching scenario, a similar deal in some XCOM scenarios, I think, to have there be two layers to stealth, where you're hiding and you get detected, but you haven't been caught, and then you have the chance to kind of move back into that hiding layer, or you spend some time in that tense detected but not caught layer, versus you're detected and then you get found or caught. Having there be more of a loop like that, some kind of counterintelligence mechanic where when enemies hear sound from your attacks on their, radar or whatever, they move closer to you and you are aware of that in some way, but they don't immediately find you. You could add just noise or like hubbub as a way to turn the knob on the balance. So in such a way, I would imagine you probably could balance the breaching thing. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to give the developers too little credit. It doesn't sound like they really did that. So maybe there isn't, for some reason it isn't that easy, or there aren't those design knobs, and they, to be fair, that's not that small of a change. You would have to make that system, right? That's not really, well, I didn't say one small change, it's called one key change, so I guess that's a fine suggestion, sure. It seems very important. The other way to think about it from a game design perspective is this is quite important to XCOM's gameplay loop, so it seems reasonable to invest a bit more development time into getting it to be a meaningful gameplay decision. I do want to come back to that thing about how if players don't know of the existence of this thing, then it can seem like it isn't a problem, because I think it's really important for understanding why these types of things may or may not be changed or fixed, as it were. If a lot of players don't know the thing is there, it can feel like a lot of work just for the player that notices this aspect of the game, which that makes it sound like, oh well, it's not improving the game for a lot of types of potential player. I don't agree. I think that this is being aware that you can aggro other enemies in the fog of war makes the game better in that you're aware of a tension that existed all along, but currently it's made then worse again by the fact that when you realize that tension, you realize there is one way around it, so you should just do that, and then you get through. Making the player aware that this quality of the game exists, but then have it be deep instead of shallow, is the ideal scenario in my mind. That is, you can't just say, oh, well, just pretend that you can't, that breaching isn't the only good tactic. People often say this. They'll say, if you feel like this tactic is the only good thing and you don't like that, just pretend that it isn't and use other things anyway. But the fun the game is trying to create is that how the combat works, but there are interesting choices to make. So while I understand where people are coming from, it feels to players like you can have the version of all you have to do is pretend a little bit, and the game kind of is the way you want it to be, right? But then why isn't it just that way? Like, why there's no need to have the player pretend. The game ought to just be that way, right? And so sure, it might take a little more work, but I think we can agree that that is game design. You can say, okay, but if you have a certain perspective, this game just is as if they had made those good changes. Okay, but it would be better if they did make those changes then, right? That's just like saying, I agree that your changes would make the game better, just you could try to do that yourself. And it's like, well, I could, but I want the developers to, because it's their job. That's not a weird thing to ask. Whether it is worth the development time, well, that's a complicated and subjective issue. I don't deign to know. I'm not sure I'm aware how much or what the development timeline situation was. That's not my job. That is also their job. And I trust them to have made the decision they were able to make. There's a reason we don't have that system in the game. They either didn't have time to implement it, but thought of it, didn't have time to think of it and then implement it, were told that it wasn't worth it. Maybe someone said everything I just said, but then the money people said, we don't agree that we should pay you more money to implement that, even though it would make the game better. I don't know. It could be any number of things, and it doesn't matter. We're just speculating on, yeah, I think that seems fixable. I don't know. I do think there's a question under here about what makes turn-based combat itself deep, but that seems like a topic for another time. I do think it's worth considering if you get the player in a position where they're firing from behind cover like that, what is the minimum you need to do to make it so there are meaningful decisions to be made, rather than you just kind of tactically running the routine, which can be fine, but will get old for a lot of kinds of players. And a lot of the time, just pushing the gameplay loop a little more can have a lot of benefits. So I don't think it is often sensible to stop at the absolute minimum that offers complexity. Firing at an enemy behind cover in a breaching scenario is, or just like a tactical gunfight that is not about blazing in or a power fantasy and is more about your mortality and hiding behind cover and such, it is already a decently deep situation in a lot of ways. There's some interesting game theory at play in just basic first-person shooters. Things like firing and needing to reload, or, how much of your body you expose versus how easily you're able to aim versus how much relative cover you have. First-person shooters and anything that mimics a shooter, like an above positioned camera, tactical, real-time strategy kind of thing like this. This is not a real-time strategy game. Whatever you want to call XCOM, already has a lot of game essence to it. So you could say there's not a lot you have to do. You just have to make it so there are a variety of positioning tactics that work. It therefore seems important that flanking is good or distinctly not a part of the game. You could say like that there are other tactics and no flanking, I guess, or flanking is a last resort or something. I do also think it's worth, as we finish up on this topic, it is worth keeping an open mind that this may not be true. This isn't an accusation, just Rusty. Just to say that whenever we notice something like this where there is a way you can think of the game's kind of metagame, where the tactics available, if you use this one, it seems to have just advantages. It is always going to be possible that you as the player are wrong, that that is really a dominant tactic. It's not very likely. I've heard this critique about XCOM before. I haven't even played XCOM, and I happen to have heard this critique about the game previously. So that's not proof. That's a small sample size, but it's very likely that a huge amount of people have also come to this conclusion, which makes it decreasingly likely that it's just wrong and there actually is some like sensible metagame. But as we always say on these channels, nobody knows all builds, and so yeah, it's worth considering that maybe there is a tactic available that makes it work. I do think for the game designer, it is an important note of caution to say, you cannot stamp your foot and say, but players just don't know that the game really is balanced. You have to accept that it is also your fault if the game really is deep, but just doesn't appear to be to almost all players. You have to accept that it first of all, you too don't know all builds. It might not be deep. It might be that it is shallow and you just haven't noticed the balance problem that everybody else has noticed. So the shoe's on the other foot in that sense, but also that it could just be that it isn't clear enough. The game doesn't make it like reasonable to realize that there is this sort of deep thing. My opinion is usually that if there's going to be a variety of options for how to deal with something, the basic tools that provide a kind of metagame where you're choosing between different options based on the benefits that they give you ought to be pretty obvious. And it should really only be those more niche tweaks or something that modifies how you're breaching round, or how a little sprint that lets you flank, or a smoke bomb or a stealth grenade or something. Modifying those effects can be like more niche or hidden away. But if the core of the gameplay requires going those several layers deep, I think that's often a problem. I think there is a magic balance where the build system has depths and you can go and discover and create something unexpected, but that the basic tools of engagement are not in those depths, that they're kind of readily available in some way. You don't have to hit the player over the head with them, but if the basic options are, like, let's say you get an upgrade tree in a game, like XCOM, and the very first upgrade you get is a little stealth kit that lets you go invisible briefly. You could maybe flank or get close to an enemy, a breaching round, and something like a radar that shows you where nearby enemies are. Those are the only three options, and you get one talent point and you pick one of them. The game is very clearly communicating to you, these are three tools for flanking enemies, pretty much. Or like enemies are behind cover, these are three tools for dealing with that. Then the game can balance around, well, okay, those are the tools we offered the player. Are they relatively balanced? Like, do they all kind of work? And then you as the player get very clearly, oh, so there's no need to go find tools to do the basic thing the game wants me to do. Here they are. And then there are just other effects to modify them. But the player cannot really not be aware that the game has that depth in that situation, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I think they're like the one key change here could be make the available tools more obvious. It probably isn't a problem. It's probably that they really aren't as deep as they need to be. But I do think it's worth considering this problem might be solved by just making things more available to the player, just putting in the face of the player the options that probably don't, but might already exist to sort of balance things out. So interesting. Yeah, I do. It's interesting to me what you said too about the Chimera Squad having fights in like enclosed rooms. That does remove a lot of this, but it kind of feels like, well, didn't you just remove a lot of the sort of push and pull of the game as well? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, that interests me, but again, I guess a topic for another time. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I did want to say that I think while I am a person who has often been a bit critical of game developers not being able to think abstractly about this stuff. Like, it kind of seems like if you have a game like XCOM just on paper, where you can flank but enemies aggro in this way, but you also have the ability to breach, cover and just rush enemies, it kind of feels like it would be obvious before you made the game that this would be a design challenge, and therefore you would make the game thinking from the very start without needing to check that, of course, we're going to need to make sure that those things are balanced. But I think, as always with game design, this is a compound medium. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts, and many people see the push and pull of the gameplay as being only one of them. You could argue that commercially, it is only one of them. I mean, if the game doesn't look and sound good, and have marketing materials that look good, and have a compelling narrative and characters, then a lot of people feel like, well, what's the point, really, if the gameplay is good? I disagree. I think that people really undersell gameplay, really don't have any faith in gameplay. And I also think that a lot of the money people don't have any respect for video games. This is not about respect. I'm being a superior or better than you, or deserved respect. I guess I just mean confidence, any awareness of the impact that, gameplay can have. I worried that a lot of the money people have no life and don't understand that games can be fun. As games, it's not a movie, it's a game. And thus you get a lot of games that put a lot of effort into everything but the gameplay, and somehow argue that as a game, a thing defined by its gameplay, the thing that they can afford to neglect is the gameplay being interesting. I personally feel quite the opposite. I mean, if you make a game, even a story-focused game, and there is gameplay, you are forcing the player to tolerate the gameplay to get to the story. It's not a movie. They can't just sit down and watch. You're interrupting their movie constantly by asking them to do something with their hands. That thing better not suck, because otherwise you're putting a very annoying chore in the middle of your movie constantly. It is shocking to me how many people say that games that have an amazing story, but a very annoying chore in the middle of that story all the time, are really good or masterpieces. I can only assume that people have become very used to that in game design, but I don't think that it is fair to evaluate such games as anything other than a failure. The gameplay is in the way. It should either be good or be gone, I feel. So go figure. There have been a number of interesting solutions to that, but I don't know. I guess all I'm doing is coming out strongly in favor of, it would be beneficial to put effort into fixing this. And again, a key point I want to leave you with about this part is that making the more players aware that this is a tension in the game, that flanking has a risk associated with it, making more players aware of the problem, but then having it be that things are actually balanced out, would make the game better. Being aware of that tension when you flank is part of the game's push and pull, but then it's just removed again because you realize that there is a more dominant tactic that lets you avoid the issue. The ideal is to make the player aware of that tension, but keep it. Not to make the player not aware of that tension, and not to make the player aware of that tension, but to then fail for, give them a solution, but a solution that just means they never have to worry about it ever again. Again, if there are choices, I think they need to matter, or you can just take them out. You don't have to give the player those choices. So I think this is a great example, a really good way to start. And also, yeah, it's completely fine to not have the change you would make be the focus. Your tone in this parlay is a little bit like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do to fix it. And yeah, I mean, I mostly don't know either. Again, I suggested, I think there are a number of knobs that one could turn, it sounds like. But yeah, I don't know which one to do. Moving on to another example about Pathfinder from iPatch Notes. Pathfinder 1st Edition has several eras of supplemental materials. Beyond the core rulebook, the CRB, and the GM guide, the next logical expansion is the Ultimate series. Ultimate Magic, Ultimate Combat, Ultimate Equipment. Books with explicit themes now that they do not have to share word count with the gateway drug, Door Wedge, that is the CRB, the core rulebook. Some tables will even go as far as banning the use of books beyond the Ultimate or Advanced series, a well-meaning but misguided attempt at balancing player power. Indeed, earlier iterations of the D&D 5th edition Adventurers League official play format, basically where you come with a character sheet pre-made using certain rules, and then different game masters can kind of hook into the game you're playing, a little bit like the West Marches style of play, if you're familiar with that. But anyway, this way of playing tabletop games, where you kind of have a player in this modular game mastering format, combined book checks, combated book checks, that is having just a ton of materials, by saying the player can bring one book to the table with them, core rule book, and then exactly one other supplement, so like some book that had extra spells in it or whatever, to constrain what kinds of characters can be made. I know that's really weird, but to clarify, this basically, they added a build system-y mechanic where you can't pull from all of the published game materials for 5th edition. You can only pull from the core rule book and then one other physical book that contains all the other character options that you want. So a very weird limitation, but the idea was that the player can't just go out of control and rifle through 10 other books for character options or rules or whatever. This could possibly also speed up gameplay a lot. You don't have to check back for some clerical thing, but very interesting. I think misguided. I would agree with you, well-meaning, not a terrible idea, but ultimately a kind of a misguided attempt at balancing player power. Pathfinder's equivalent, Pitch Notes continues, official format, the Pathfinder Society, had no such limitation, but the player had to provide proof of purchase for any books involved in their character's creation. Is this pay to build? Lol? No lol from me. That's just pay to win. That's bad. Don't do that. I don't think that's a good idea, but okay, that's fascinating. Thank you. Back to the mix. Vanilla fighters get a class feature named Weapon Training, giving a token +1 accuracy and damage boost for a group of weapons they name, spears if the player likes those. Captain may recall Pathfinder's archetype or subclass system that lets players give up agency to fulfill one specific fantasy. The Archer Fighter does not put weapon training on their character sheet, instead putting Expert Archer. That feature gets kind of upgraded or changed out for weapon training. Note that Expert Archer has the same effects of weapon training, bows, but the Archer Fighter does not have a class feature named weapon training anymore. This is important. They made a change where when you pick the Expert Archer, your weapon training feature, which if you had set to bows would have done the same thing, is renamed to, Expert Archer. But it is the same effect as weapon training if you had named bows. It's just now called something else for reasons I don't totally understand. We'll get into it in a minute. Many such early fighter subclasses lose weapon training to rebrand it, changing the name but not the outcome. With my own word count out of the way, there's a massive power gap in the fighter timeline. Years after the Ultimate and Advanced series come the Handbook series. It doesn't seem like much of a progression, but okay. These books are even more specific to certain fantasies, like the Dragon Slayer's Handbook, the Giant Hunter's Handbook. Oh, I get it, okay. And the Weapon Master's Handbook. Oh no. Starting with Weapon Master's Handbook, all fighters that have the Weapon Training class feature have an additional toolbox of options called Advanced Weapon Trainings to pick from. Choice specimens include making a weapon finessable when it would not be, such as scaling with dexterity on like a great axe that normally wouldn't. Making damage dice scale with level, for example a whip that does 2d6 instead of 1d3. Ooh. Reproducing explicitly magical effects through hard work and non-magical guts, somehow. Okay, so powerful. But now we have a bit of a problem. Those pre-2015 subclasses like Archer, none of them have access to advanced weapon trainings because those subclasses renamed weapon training for no benefit. Remember when you took that Archer fighter class from before, weapon training was renamed to Expert Archer, even though it does the same thing as weapon training. So now because it doesn't have the weapon training tag, if you will, it doesn't work with this future supplement. Again, a token +1 to accuracy and damage is what these classes are getting. It's just not called weapon training anymore, so they can't hook into this advanced weapon training system. The greatest travesty in my mind is that the advanced weapon trainings turn on as early as 5th level, or as late as 9th level. Some older fighter subclasses are glacial by comparison, at 11th level or worse 13th level. All such subclasses are without access to the then newest and explosive options. I bet Notes has a very strong bias to stop play at 12th level, just before wizards in the gang get the 7th tier of spells, a very common breakpoint, 12th level, and some fighter subclasses only awaken at 13th level as a cruel joke. While my party members traveled to other planes, I studied the blade, because that is what non-magical martials have to put up with. Oof. Equal opportunity is a feature. At 13th level, when a 2-weapon warrior makes an attack of opportunity, they may attack once with both of their primary and secondary weapons. The penalties for attacking with 2 weapons apply normally. This training replaces Weapon Training 3. Side note, Pathfinder has a system where each character has a per-turn allotment of opportunity attacks. These can be burned offensively or even defensively. In this case, 2-weapon warrior functionally doubles their allotted opportunity attacks, but at 13th level is, I think, a little late for that to come online. Is equal opportunity a 5th level class feature? Probably not. 13th level, though? Too late. Definitely not. 9th level kind of sounds fine. I feel like I would not be asking for a lot to have these rigidly scheduled subclasses be arranged like advanced weapon trainings. A 5th level, pick a subclass feature. 9th level, pick another one, you know. Like how non-fighters and rogues and wizards are structured. Fighters are both free to pick what they want, and some of the most strangled player classes. While Pathfinder has historically issued errata, developer patches that live in the forums, and reprints of older player options, many of the oldest player options never received such attention. As such, many archetypes, feats, etc. are swept under the rug as bad when some wording tweaks would set them right. I tend to pay more mind to these kinds of game pieces as creative exercise, despite some of the futility of a closed box. You know, their books are already printed this way. Pathfinder 2nd edition is not the same, Mom. Indeed. Cool. Yep, so this is an example where we have a little bit more like my initial example. We have a specific thing that you could make a specific and incredibly minor change to that would take, and nobody would take any meaningful time to make, and that could meaningfully wake up this design. A lot of fighter subclasses basically detag their weapon training feature, but it doesn't actually do anything mechanically. They kind of just reworded that for a gameplay benefit. So reading the rules as written, technically you don't have weapon training anymore. Even though you do, it was just named something different. In terms of lore, for example, your game master might, perhaps ought to, reasonably conclude that the expert archer class feature is weapon training. I mean, what it is your character trained with their weapon to become an expert archer. Whether it's called weapon training or transformed into expert archer, it is weapon training. I mean, I'm not saying it's lowercase weapon training. I'm saying it's uppercase. It was uppercase weapon training. Just because it was rebranded for the flavor of the class doesn't mean the character somehow doesn't have the weapon training they went through before, right? It just transformed as a game mechanic name. So I would rule that you absolutely get that benefit. Just like how if I give you a spell and then you get an upgraded version of the spell for flavor, unless there's some lore related reason why it wouldn't be able to do things the previous version of the spell couldn't do, as far as I'm aware, you're still casting the same spell. It's just better. Me giving you your own flavorful name for that better version of the spell in no way means you can't use it for the things you normally could have used it for, I don't think. But sure, the strictly rules as written. I'm not saying there's no problem here. I'm just saying it's very reasonable to want that to work, right? The player absolutely does have the thing that they need to have. The book just, not with much foresight, chose to rebrand it as this different named thing. So the small change would be either make some of the features, like equal opportunity, be a lower level so that fighters can progress to other stuff more easily and don't need the advanced weapon trainings as much, or just reword the older books and make them say weapon training still, because it doesn't really change anything other than unlocking these to do that. Now, a concern I want to head off. A lot of the time, this situation has some balancing, like thingies attached to it, some little suckers that make the balancing difficult. It may be that focusing on the somewhat pedantic interpretation where like, oh, but it's not weapon training, so the older subclasses can't use these. You could imagine that there's a world where the new advanced weapon trainings are balanced with that lack of compatibility with older subclasses in mind. It sounds to me, eye patch notes, like you're saying the older fighter subclasses are underpowered anyway, so probably not. Probably the advanced weapon trainings were not made with it in mind that they'd be like too strong if the older fighter subclasses had access to them. I'm just saying, sure, there could be unintended consequences there, but it would be better to just balance those out and let people use the things if that's your intention. Having some things be exclusive to certain characters isn't bad, but this doesn't feel like it was really intended that they were exclusive to those character archetypes, just that they didn't really bother to future-proof when they made the early fighter subclasses, and then they probably figure players just don't care about that much anymore. As you said, often for these tabletop role-playing games with physical books, the players still receive patches, just in text. The book doesn't physically change always, and often not for the older player options. Often it's for the newer ones that the developers are hearing discussed. Again, there's a part of me as the abstraction-focused game developer that is a little frustrated by this. It kind of feels like if you make things using the system, it doesn't matter. The players focusing more on a certain aspect of the game's design doesn't matter. If you were a developer who was good at making the game's build systems, it would be easy to notice that this isn't really ideologically consistent, but, well, I guess the world isn't full of as ideologically consistent people as I'm suggesting, and you know what? They've shipped games and I haven't, so maybe that makes thinking that way makes it that much more difficult to make games. I don't know. I don't think it does, but that's... Anyway, it's hard when you have printed books, certainly. I think what makes me hopeful is that if you want to be a little cynical, you could say that if you just had a system to begin with, this is totally foreseeable. Why change the name of the feature when in the future you might want to hook into that name in some way? That doesn't seem like very good future proofing. If you want to be optimistic, it seems to me like a set of pretty broad general rules for how to write your supplements for a tabletop role-playing game would basically just make this not happen. It would head it off at the pass. So don't name the feature something different, or use tags. Add the weapon training tag to expert archer, or anything that is a transformation of the weapon training skill. That way it still works with things that mention weapon training in the future. Or you can always say it has to be named weapon training, and therefore even things with the weapon training tag don't work, and now you've created a knob. You can make it work with them or not, and the rules as written support either approach. You can imagine that that approach would be better for any, even unknown future supplements that you would add, because it leaves you the freedom to choose as the designer whether you want these to work with that option or not. So I think the optimist in me says there is a set of guidelines for making these types of game supplement materials that just makes this not a problem always, and you don't have to foresee these things being an issue. It's just always better to do it, with tags or something. They're more or less always better. A lot of people bring up complexity with these situations, and to be completely honest with you, audience, I'm kind of sick of the complexity thing. I'm kind of sick of players and developers arguing that you shouldn't put tags on it, or you shouldn't add details to your game feature because that will scare players off. Just how much game design excellence are we going to hold hostage because we're afraid that some players will think it's a bit more complicated? Have you read Pathfinder's Handbook? Have you played Pathfinder before? Do you think adding a tag to the ability is gonna scare players off from Pathfinder? Get out of here. Like, for some games, I get it, I do. I think there are plenty of games where there is a benefit to knowing the specifics and the game doesn't show you them or doesn't make things more complicated, and there is an argument that that is a reasonable decision. It's a trade-off, and I think it's really frustrating when it isn't seen as the trade-off that it objectively is. Like, clearly giving the player more information can help some people learn, even if it isn't useful, and an abstraction can make things harder. But a simplification is useful for some players too, and keeping things streamlined is good. Adding detail you're not going to use is bad, sure. But for this kind of game where supplements in the future are going to hook into existing features, it's pretty foreseeable that you're going to want some flexibility in how those features combine. Is it really that weird to just add, yeah, like tags that say this is a variant of weapon training to an ability, and then you have the option to kind of turn that faucet on or off later? I don't think so. That's not overcomplicating things that much. And I personally feel like this mindset that things ought to be as simple as they can be just doesn't really work in practice. Like if you look at games that, whether intentionally or not, are applying this ideology, like Pathfinder in this case, well, the result is that it's very complicated which features work with which subclasses, right? So by not having that initial slight increase in complexity, the ability now has tags under it. We've ended up in a situation in the long term where the network in which these abilities are connected is labyrinthine and irregular and not standardized at all. Doesn't seem like a particularly profitable exchange to me. It would have been better to just make the feature slightly more complicated on the face by just having a little tag under it that says weapon training, and then in the long run, that makes things much simpler. So I really reject the idea that it is better because it keeps things simpler. You shouldn't add the tag or the knob. Of course, iPatchNote's other suggested change of just making some of the other features be lower level so that you don't feel like you're missing out on advanced weapon training is reasonable. I just kind of feel like both would be good. Like it would be a good change to regularize stuff as well. So yeah, pretty interesting. I don't know. I fear a little suggesting that there would be some set of guidelines that is like always good. Basically, anytime something feels like it's good general advice, I don't know, maybe I have too little faith in people, but literally any advice taken to its extreme is going to be bad. And so sure, like I guess you shouldn't literally always add tags to everything. I guess it's just like, look, there have been RPGs before. Pathfinder, as a fork of D&D yourself, surely you could have foreseen that there would be future supplements, and you have every intention of writing them the same way as D&D did in the past. And therefore, you are going to run into future-proofing issues, and therefore it is reasonable to add tags. So, yeah, like, I'm sure for some games this is more difficult, right? It's like, yeah, adding a little bit of a design hook, like a tag to a skill, so that you can interact with it more modularly in your game design, included in a feature or not. Yeah, that's gonna be good for a lot of games, but to be fair, for weird games that are not just like a sort of a fork of D&D that has become its own thing, it might be harder to foresee what would be good to do to future-proof things out. I just feel like in this case, it like really isn't hard to see what will be better down the line. So I think that's the good change to make. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Pathfinder and games like it often remind me that you have to make a game that is, is broad and well liked and supplemented and exists and makes money and such, to have a game that people know about which is well balanced. And so it's always reasonable to say, well, this game is popular but it's got its flaws. It's like, while there's no law of physics that says that it couldn't not have those flaws and still be popular, not having those flaws wouldn't make it unpopular, for example. It's often the case that in practice on the ground, the game has those flaws because it managed to get to market, because they had a limited development budget and they had investors and therefore they had limited time or other incentives on making the game. And those things are why the game is here at all. So indirectly, they are tied up in why the game isn't as good as it could otherwise be. I am painfully aware that in practice that is often the case. At the same time, if you're like me, you're really holding on to that idea like, okay, but there's nothing stopping the game from just being a frictionless, pleasant experience and being successful. You would just need to have a judicious use of the time available, and many of these changes would take a very small amount of time to make and have no real drawbacks. And so if only we could have a timeline where you saw that coming. I just feel like if you develop games, it's very, very useful to have this mindset, because when a moment like this comes along, you have a chance for no real cost in the long run to just do it in a good future-proofy way. And then in the future, if the game goes on to do well, you didn't really pay any cost and the game will just be better. And I think that can really add up. Occasionally, I think a game manages to get through and get made with this mindset, with this process intact, where the developers had time to kind of head off all these future-proofy things. And the result is often a game that feels just beautifully buttery smooth. And video games are such a media where it's not like a book, for example. A novel can often be mostly complete. Like there's just nothing really glaringly wrong about it. I've certainly read books before that upon deep analysis, I just don't find much wrong with them. And the problems I have are like really minor, like things I could easily overlook. I'm reading a sequel of a book right now, and this book has a kind of involved magic system. And the author, for some reason, has chosen to really rehash things. Like every time something that happened in book one comes up in book two, the author momentarily behaves as if you don't know that that happened, which is odd to me. Are they worried that people will read book two without reading book one? But it's like their sequels aren't really their thing. And so maybe they're not used to that in sequels, but they said they worked particularly differently because it was a sequel. In the preface, they talk about it, like, this was my first sequel. I don't know why they're doing that. That's very weird to me. But that's such a minor issue as to not reduce my flow moving through the book. You know what I mean? I notice it, but it's like a speed bump when you're driving that's been worn down a lot. You know what I mean? If there's a speed bump and you're driving along, yeah, like you're probably going to slow down, but there's a threshold where there's a bump you notice, but you don't have to meaningfully slow down. I mean, you shouldn't speed through speed bumps. I'm just saying, you get what I mean? Are you on the highway and there's a minor construction or something, and you can move over it without really slowing down meaningfully? You notice it, but it isn't enough to actually be a speed bump. And so, while not perfect, there are plenty of pieces of media, often less composite pieces of media. Again, a poem maybe, or a novel in my example, or you could tell an oral story. These pieces of media are arguably made of about one part, and so it's more often to consume one where it is more or less objectively complete and there are minimal actual interrupting speed bumps. That is common with those types of media. You can read a lot of books if you have any meaning, without that much effort, in my opinion, if you have any meaningful targeting method for picking books. You can read a lot of books that have almost zero friction to the experience. You can basically just do it and there are no meaningful problems, I guess. Video games, in my opinion, are not like that. They're a very compound piece of media. And when you look at it, much larger of a percentage of video games, especially like successful and popular video games, are arguably not actually complete, fully complete. There are basic design goals, basic aspects of how they function that don't fully work. And this is normal because there's just so many moving parts to a video game. It's not good or necessary. You could have a video game that is largely just complete. And I feel like I've played a few games over the years that were kind of like frictionless to an extent. But I do think it's the case that video games are much more often defined by being a compromise of like what isn't fully actually finished or working about the game, and then the game can maybe have higher highs because it's using a variety of different elements. And that's a trade-off that you make. Personally, being very picky, I feel like you can kind of just try to play only those games which kind of are complete as per se, to a point, but there are so few games that I feel like feel that way that not really, you can't get real perspective on the industry or gaming as a hobby, and you leave a lot of fun on the table that only requires a little bit of tolerance to enjoy if you are not willing to play games that are like a bit incomplete, I guess is how I feel. This isn't really an excuse. I'm usually the one coming down hard on games being like this. I just feel like it's always worth considering that especially when modifying or tweaking a game. I bet notes I know this is something you're not personally a huge fan of, but one of the reasons I'm more open to it in video games is that the game is providing more materials, sound design and visual design, and its gameplay mechanics and its story, and so I'm willing to do a little more work, up from no work at all if I were reading a book, for example, to make the experience kind of work. I'm willing to put in a little more from me. Part of the reason I like build systems so much is because they allow the player to have kind of a relationship with that about the game. The game is going to need a little bit of the player's input anyway, is the way I've always seen build systems. People who don't like build systems, I think, have this idea that the game can just be you don't need to input anything and it's just a good experience. But my experience has been that very few games are like that. So if I need to do my part anyway, I'd kind of rather the game just gives me an interesting system through which to do my part to adapt to the game, rather than it being something I need to do anyway, but which the game doesn't really give me knobs to turn to manipulate. I don't know. And so whether it's matching your playstyle or just moving around part of the game you don't like, I think build systems can be the holy grail of this. You can kind of build around these things. And in the example of a tabletop role-playing game like Pathfinder, you have a type of game where the game master is invited to just do a bit of their own input. So to be fair, I do think this is a kind of gray area for modding, where you as the game master can absolutely just say, oh yeah, no, like advanced weapon training works with expert archer. It just does work. Like that's completely reasonable. It just does work. Or, you know, I'm always reminded of D&D's thing with druids. In the description of druids' weapon and armor proficiencies, it says that druids are compatible with medium armor, but then it says druids will not wear metal, basically, or something to that effect. Now, no other wording in all of 5th edition is worded this way. It's only that one thing about druids. It says they have medium armor proficiency. Full stop, they have medium armor proficiency. Many medium armor types are almost always, it's hard to conceive them without being made of metal. But then it says druids will not wear metal. And so, I mean, can they use a shield? If the shield is wood, but it has a metal stud on it, can they not use it? Can a druid wear rings and use a weapon that isn't made of metal? I would think yes. And so how much metal means the druid can't use the item? I think it's stupid and confusing for druids not to be able to wear metal, and that is something the player would want to do as a role-playing choice for how their druid works, not something that is a good rule. After all, there is no definition of exactly which things are metal. This is just inviting a pedant to argue the version they prefer of the situation. That is not a good piece of game design. You could say, I want druids to not be able to use the better metal medium armors, but they can wear hide armor or something like that. If that's what you want, say that in the rules. You could say that it's a role-playing prompt. Don't put it in the armor proficiency section, and just in the spellcasting say, druids may have trouble spellcasting if they're wearing metal. Okay, like that's easier to get around if the player is building their character. They can definitely wear metal, but you may rule that your druid has trouble spellcasting if they're, yeah, you get it. You see what I mean? And so that's a case where the game master needs to make a ruling. The game is not actually complete until the game master decides what that means. It's not the same situation as this one here, where, I mean, there is a pretty unambiguous rules as written answer. Advanced weapon training does not work with expert archer. It says that it doesn't work directly. Now, that's the only interpretation that means it wouldn't work. Expert archer basically is weapon training, and so by that logic it works. Your character did physically have literally weapon training before getting expert archer, so in that sense it works. And the game master's balancing sensibilities, well, you're almost certainly going to conclude that it's a good idea for it to work, because the older subclasses are probably weaker and would appreciate that boost in flexibility. And again, you could just make equal opportunity be a different level feature as well. But indeed, there is technically a rules as written thing where unambiguously it doesn't work. In D&D, often, there literally is no rules as written interpretation. Even if you say, it's unambiguous, and people do often say this, it's unambiguous, druids can't wear metal, why are you complicating it so much? I explained it before, because it is not objective which things contain metal. There are many items that a druid would like to use, which do not have an objective amount of metal that they contain. And again, like when you say metal armor, like is studded leather, you know, studded with metal studs, is that metal armor? I would say no, in the same way that jewelry is not metal armor, as it were. Is a studded shield metal armor? I think that's getting closer. A lot of wooden shields could have pretty significant metal bands keeping them together. So if you want to be pedantic, I personally feel like that is the item that is the most in a gray area for me. It is very significantly made of wood, but it is also very significantly made of metal. And one could argue that were it only wood, it would still barely, if there was something else holding it together, be a functional shield. And if it was only the metal, it would still barely, if there was something holding the metal parts together, be a functional shield. And therefore, it is at least metal armor, I guess. But that's a very strangely ontological argument when you could just say whether you want shields to be good for druids or not. And the kicker for me is it makes a huge difference whether druids can use a shield and the best medium armor. That's like 5 AC that they don't get otherwise. Druids have like 5 more armor class, are like 25 to 50% harder to hit in practice if they can or cannot use metal armor. That is a big design decision to just not make, basically, and to make players feel like, oh, it has been made, but nobody agrees because they haven't actually made it. There is no purely objective interpretation. And to be fair, D&D has always said this. You know, the game designers of D&D have said our intent was often for there not to be a rules as written interpretation. You need to interpret the things in the game. It says in the books in the game, and the designers of the game say, and none of that matters. Common sense tells you that you need to interpret these things, and that it should be fine to just like make a decision and explain your reasoning and have a conversation with your players. Oh, I'm sorry, is that too much to ask? Getting a little bit to one of my pet peeves again, are we? Push your feelings down and let's do example 3. From True Parley Grandmaster Foot, who brings up Minecraft's inventory loss upon death, a relic of its early survival game days. Early on in its alpha and beta, all the items were easily replaced. Tools and armor were expendable goods to keep up the cycle of exploration, resource gathering, building, and then looping. Losing all your items on death added spice to the gameplay loop without being overly punishing, and very typical of a survival gameplay loop, right? But Minecraft started to shift over the years. Enchantments were added to speed up all aspects of the game, like enchantments for your tools, and suddenly tools stopped being easy to replace. You would enchant your mining pick, or I have never played Minecraft, so I don't know, like a mining pick to be a, adamantium aura mining pick, and now you can mine more times without it breaking. Maybe is that how it works? You would have to stop the gameplay loop every X hours to replace your efficient tools. But the efficiency gain was so massive with the enchantments that the break to go get an enchanted one again was worth it. Okay? This was unpopular. Yeah, I can see that, right? So the developers added in the mending enchantment, which allows you to regenerate durability. Tools, weapons, and armor stopped being expendable, and they became a progression mechanic instead. To play into this aspect of the game, and to encourage exploration once again, Mojang, the developer, added rare items like tridents and maces, rare customizations to your armor, and the hard-to-get netherite upgrade, which improved your items beyond diamond. All of these things take a lot of time and grinding, and this is fine because Minecraft has become a progression game. Tools are not expendable anymore, they become a part of your player identity. And the item loss on death still exists to this day. Only now, it doesn't take 1 minute of crafting to replace your gear upon death, but hours of gameplay instead. This leads to bizarre player behavior. One of the newer additions, the mace, along with its enchantments, is so hard to acquire that players are too scared to lose it upon death, and they never use them in the first place. Many of modern Minecraft's pains would be fixed if the devs reverted items back to being easier to acquire, like in its old survival game roots, or if they fully committed to the progression game they'd been creating. All of this is complicated by how iconic the inventory loss is. Great example. So yeah, here again we have a kind of diverged path where you can decide what direction you want to go in. Sort of like the previous example, you could make it so other fighter features are just more available to the fighter subclasses that can't use the advanced weapon trainings, or you could make them gain access to the advanced weapon training, depending on which route you want to go. Here we have a clearer example of that. You're going in the direction of a progression-focused game, so it sounds like losing your items on death doesn't fit the game anymore. That doesn't really fit that design loop. So why not just remove it? Well, there are a few problems. One is that, of course, that it is something people have associated as being part of the game. I want to argue that that doesn't matter at all, but it does matter to a lot of people. It's what they're used to, and I'm sure it would have knock-on effects for other parts of the design, where player behavior has been adapted, and the balance of items has probably been adapted in a few cases, to this compromised design, where there's a big element, the permadeath, or losing items when you die, that it doesn't really fit with how the game has been balanced in other ways. So just changing it probably does have some knock-on consequences, so it would at least mean making other changes down the line as well to fully kind of, I call it propagating the ideology. You have the idea for a progression-based version of Minecraft, but that idea has not fully propagated through the game's many systems. And so until it has, the game has some design elements that are kind of actively fighting other design elements. It's not the rarest thing in the world, but certainly uncommon and unadvisable to change your game's game essence in the middle of your game existing. Because until you have completed that process, every single part of the game that isn't from the previous game essence has the potential to kind of fight against the new game essence. You could, of course, instead go back and try to make a marriage of the two types of gameplay. A progression mechanic game that has the permadeath, or I keep saying permadeath, losing your items on death mechanic. You could try to find a way to marry those two things, sure. It doesn't seem like they are exactly trying to do that. So it would be interesting to see what would happen if they would consider, well, what if we just fully commit to that? Again, the progression gameplay. What if we fully propagate that throughout the game? What other consequences are there versus saying, well, we're going to go for a compromise route instead. We're not going to fully propagate the progression mechanic thing. We're going to find a way to marry a progression mechanic and the game's survival roots. That, I don't know how you would do that. That would be interesting. I would like to see a game like that. But at the moment, it seems like they have a kind of unintended blend of both, or not unintended, but not fully reined in blend of both. They just chose to add a lot of progression mechanics and dealt with the resulting mix of elements. Not the end of the world, but certainly not as good as, doing one or the other intentionally. Cool. So, yeah, I think the interesting additional layer is that Minecraft gives you a game rule, keep inventory, that if toggled on, makes you keep your inventory upon death. Not everybody knows about this because it's hidden in the settings of the world. If you play Minecraft multiplayer, it's up to the host whether that game rule is changed, and that game rule enables some unintentional strategies like dying. Oh no! Fast travel to your spawn. Yikes, apparently that didn't agree with me. It's a solution, but not a good one, because it removes the one thing that inventory loss still has going for it, adding pressure and consequences to your decisions, meaning that if you wanted to remove the inventory loss, you would have to figure out a suitable replacement as a source of pressure on the player during exploration and combat. And as you said, one of the nice pieces of transparency is since you can set up a rule like this on your own already, we can look ahead a little. I was saying before, if you want to fully propagate the progression thing and remove losing your items on death, well, there would be at least some consequences, and you've got one of them right here. It is now probably very valuable to die to fast travel to your spawn location. Like, that is odd. Or maybe you embrace that as part of the game, though that's probably a pretty significant tonal shift for the game. But anyway, go figure. The foreseeable problems like that. And as you said, part of the game essence is that there is some pressure on the player and their decisions in the open world. And so, yeah, having it be that there's some replacement tension, besides losing your inventory when you die, is still important to the gameplay loop. As a side note, you said when you die, your items aren't usually lost immediately. They're instead dropped on the ground, and you and another player can pick them up before the 5-minute timer makes them despawn. While it can result in a fun scramble to get to where you died, this is incredibly inconsistent. See, the 5-minute timer only ticks down when the chunk the items are in is loaded. Ah, okay, so if you're far away from it or something, whether a chunk is loaded in or not depends on a bunch of technical details that are not explicitly a part of the artistic text of the game. Bizarrely, this 5-minute timer makes dying more frustrating than losing the items outright due to how obscure that whole ordeal is. Very interesting problem. Okay, so another maybe not foreseen design problem is that your items have 5 minutes until they time out, but for unrelated purposes, for the optimization of the game, parts of the world load at different times in an unpredictable and arcane pattern. Therefore, the player has an unknown 5 minutes-ish of time to get back to their stuff, not specifically any set or intended amount of time. This is a problem. This means the player doesn't know how long they have to get back to their items. You could argue this is an interesting piece of emergent gameplay, depending on how unreliable it is. For example, if on average the player has 4 to 6 minutes, it's a coherent enough band of time that you could say it adds some tension, not knowing exactly when you can get back. Maybe. Personally, that sounds like kind of a pain to me, but I can see it being an interesting piece of the game's texture, I guess. Sure. But if it varies from like 2 to 10 minutes, I think that's bad. That means you have not even remotely an idea whether you're going to have enough time. And so if you die and you go back pretty far from your body, you're thinking, I either have way more than enough time or it is a waste of time to run back to my stuff. That is bad, in my opinion. It should be that maybe it's tense whether you'll make it in time, but not nowhere near close enough, or you have hours to get back to where your stuff is. Like, that doesn't seem good to me. Again, it's a place where the game has kind of removed design knobs, without installing some better system for things to load. The game can't choose to rebalance that element that much, which makes matters worse, right? Were you to make it so the pressure on the player was different, you want their items to drop when they die, but you want them to reliably be able to run and get them back. You would want it to be that you could balance out the amount of time that they had to go back and get their items, but you kind of can't as it stands currently because the amount of time they have is somewhat random. Suddenly, the knock-on effect of making this little change is pretty large. If you make it so the player doesn't lose their items on death, then you need to figure out what to do about, for example, dying to fast travel to your spawn point. That might be something you leave in. Maybe the game survives that balance decision, but I would imagine it makes traversing the open world a pretty different experience. I do want to put a little pressure on this because I find that players tend to disregard this as an important part of game design. Some people will say, oh, it's fine. Like, a new part of the game is you die to fast travel, and that's okay. And it might be okay. That's not inherently bad. The concern is just that it does change the flow of the game a lot. It sounds convenient for the player, but things being convenient for the player in just the right proportion is important for a game's balance. Making things too easy makes other parts of the gameplay loop not feel worth it. I think a lot of people are simply not convinced that mild inconvenience with an interesting gameplay loop around it is fun. But it is. That is what is fun about most games. It is that they have an interesting inconvenience that has a compelling loop around it, not that the game is utterly frictionless in every possible way. It's fun for things to be a need that you tackle and solve. It's just not fun for them to be an annoyance that you have to eliminate to enjoy yourself. And therefore, the idea that dying to fast travel to your spawn would be bad for the game, I hope should be uncontroversial. It may not actually be, but the idea that it is a thing of concern for the game's design, yeah, it totally is. Just because it's a convenience for the player in isolation does not mean that it's going to be good for the game's fun overall. In a way that players usually won't impose on themselves. They're going to think, well, it's a convenience for me, so I want it. The pure player who doesn't think about game design literally at all, increasingly rare these days, and I think that's a good thing, would probably want the ability to die to fast travel for no cost. But that doesn't mean that it is a good game design decision to put that in. It may or may not be. It's complicated. If you don't change this, then in the current situation, you can't easily rebalance the player's ability to go back and get their items after they die, because the 5-minute timer isn't exactly a reliable 5-minute timer. That would have to be made a reliable timer for it to be made part of the game mechanic that when you die, you can go back and get your stuff, keeping your progression mechanic, but it's kind of tense in a coherent way. You would need it to be that there was a reliable ballpark of time in which you go back and get your stuff. Otherwise, the game basically just feels like you randomly lose your stuff sometimes. That can be fine. I don't know. I think that's not a good idea most of the time. The player may very understandably rage quit if they at random lose their really rare thing. And random things like this often make it feel like, well, if I spend 5 hours grinding up this thing, it's random whether I keep it when I die. Whether I have to spend 5 hours is random. That's not good. I'm reminded of the card Gamble, I believe it's called, from Magic. Gamble is a 1 mana red spell that lets you search your library for a card, put it in your hand, but then you randomly discard 1 card. So if you have 5 cards in your hand and you play Gamble, you have 1 out of 5 cards is the card you just look for. Let's assume you don't want to discard it, which sometimes you might. In those cases, Gamble is very good. But anyway, and then you have a 1 in 5 chance to discard the card you just searched for, largely meaning that casting Gamble did nothing, or you wasted a card. So a little risky in exchange for how efficient of a tutor it is. But the thing about that type of randomness is in 1 in 5 games, you wouldn't draw a Gamble or that card you searched for. That type of randomness is already present in Magic the Gathering, and when you discard the card you picked with Gamble, you don't waste 5 real-life hours by having your piece of gear randomly deleted. You might waste 5 minutes, because the game you'll end up losing at random and then shuffle up and play again. But I mean, that's the game to an extent, right? And that's not that long. Like, I think it's reasonable to say it's okay for the player to lose 2 minutes of progress. Like, that's fine. There are ways to make your shuffling and reloading for a game quicker, but topic for another time. So I do think that that is a bad form of randomness, and that other solutions, like making it random what items you lose, which is sort of the situation already in a way, are inadequate. Like, that's pretty bad. It's not the absolute worst it could possibly be, but I mean, if the change doesn't really make it, opens up a whole can of worms, you can see why it might be left the way it is, right? Instead of making how long your stuff times out a more coherent mechanic, or making it so you don't lose your stuff when you die, but then they kind of address the balance issues that causes. For now, it just is this way, I guess. You can see why it would be left that way. It's sort of like, well, but we can easily make the change, but we can't easily make that change be a fully propagated, complete design decision that is coherent for the game without a lot of additional work. So in this particular case, it feels like, yeah, the change itself is very small, so small you can actually do it yourself already with that game rule. But on the whole, you can't really accomplish the overall goal of removing that bump from gameplay easily. That would be a larger undertaking. It's a big part of the gameplay loop. So I don't think it's not worth development resources to do that, but this is definitely not the same in terms of scope to change as the fighter subclass and other feature thing we were talking about before, where you literally can just snap your hands and make the balance better. It's extremely trivially easy and very likely not to have any unintended consequences to, again, like allow advanced weapon trainings to be on the weaker, earlier fighter subclasses. I don't know. I mean, in many cases, I feel like Minecraft also mirrors the thing I was saying about tabletop role-playing games before, where these are games that kind of require a little bit of your own input anyway, and so to an extent, I feel like it's kind of okay in a way it isn't for some other games, for Minecraft to leave this a little hanging. Whereas in a game like XCOM, you're not going to be able to, well, maybe you can actually, but you probably can't. In many games like that, customize the rules to make it so flanking and aggroing a pot of enemies over here is more coherent, a balanced part of the game. You may very likely not be able to rebalance that stuff yourself. But in games like Minecraft, you often can rebalance those things yourself. And so you could say, well, games as an enterprise do require a little bit of the player's input. Maybe it's not so bad if the player kind of needs to decide what they want to do about that on their own. Sure, first. I don't think that's unreasonable. That's not the end of the world. But I still feel like it's worth considering, okay, but what is the game's design going for to an extent? This reminds me of a general thing about modding that we can close up on, where because I think a lot of games, and as I said at the very beginning of the parlay, often pretty good games, are kind of vulnerable to this one key change situation, where a lot of the time, because they're pretty good broadly, there will be 1 or 2 points of friction where games are complicated mediums, so they've kind of failed at a few minor things. But because the game is quite good, it would be a very smooth experience if only you could fix those few minor things. Modding sometimes allows you to make those changes. And there have been games, particularly Risk of Rain 2, where I feel like making very small changes you can make with mods that are broadly available kind of wakes up elements of the design so elegantly with so few, almost no design consequences, that I'm tempted to argue that that is more the real form of the game than the actual real box form of the game. I'm not going to argue that as such because it's pedantic and doesn't do anything to argue that. But it is worth considering. I mean, what is the point of, so crowbars in Risk of Rain 2? These are items that when enemies have very high health, you do much more damage to them. Naturally, this means that attacks that hit for a lot of damage in one hit are generally better with crowbars because you get the damage benefit for more of your damage. If you have a rapid fire machine gun, you'll get the bonus for only that very high portion of the enemy's health, but have a single punch attack that does a big amount of damage, and when the enemy's at high health, you'll have the damage boost, and your attack will probably bring them to like low health. You did a lot more than just that little top part of their health worth of extra damage. So it's very valuable having crowbars on characters that have an attack like that hits for a lot of damage in one go, because hitting a high health enemy will boost a larger amount of damage. But they're not very valuable when you don't have a character like that. And sometimes in Risk of Rain 2, your abilities change throughout the run to some extent, or how you use them changes throughout the run. So being able to pick crowbars flexibly is an interesting thing about the game, because it means that you can choose them when they are advantageous, and when they're not advantageous, you don't get them. Now, Risk of Rain 2, as default without mods, doesn't usually let you choose what items you get. It does have some system for when you get items that don't really do anything with your current character or build as such, and that is to scrap them. You can go to a scrapper item that can be randomly in the world and consume your thing to get a generic item of that rarity. When you find a printer, something that makes multiple copies of an item, your scrap is prioritized. So you basically get a token for your crowbar in this case that allows you to redeem another item of the same rarity eventually. This is the system the game offers, to kind of even out that randomness to an extent. But I think that adding a mod that makes everything into a multi-shop, 3 items that you choose between instead of 1 random item of that level, causes the game's design to kind of wake up a little bit as such. It makes getting movement speed and basic tools of engagement like that more reliable, and I don't think that the game is good when those things are not reliable. I think that having 3 movement speed items at the basic rarity is intended to make it so you get movement speed consistently, but you just don't get it completely consistently, and that it doesn't really change the good experience of the game to make that consistent. And then for items like crowbars, it makes it so you can more consistently get them when they would be good, which is a big buff to crowbars. But it also means that more of the loot decisions are meaningful. It's also not as if having 3 options between items means you always get something relevant to your character. It's not like that means scrapping is now completely useless. That's still a useful and powerful part of the game. Another dimension of scrapping items is just to trade in worse items on your build for more copies of an item you find a printer for that is better for your build. So it's a very robust addition to the game's gameplay loop. Is the game incomplete without it? Are there a lot of items that benefit highly from this feature and don't really work very often unless you have this feature? Yeah, I think so. And so as a result, there's this sort of limbo land with the game where there are kind of 2 very similar, reasonable ways to tackle that design thing with random items. I just wanted to make the broader point that it's possible when you mod these things in or consider these changes, these 1 key changes that could be added, to just keep in mind what the gameplay push and pull of them is, rather than just patching the problem, thinking about it as, well, is sort of meant to leave some problems open, or like what else in the design is addressing it, is valuable. And I think this is where a lot of people trip up because they have their attachment to how they want it to be. I'm tempted, because I like the multi-shops version of the game, to argue that that is kind of like, that kind of completes the game's design. That's how I've worded it in the past, and I think that's wrong. I think the scrappers largely address the issue. They just address it in a different way that swings a little more toward embracing the randomness, which is what the game is trying to do. I do think that there is some quality of life benefits without really making the game not about getting random items, if you do the multi-shop thing. But I mean, it is arguable. The truth is, I just like the multi-shop thing more. I personally don't think it is very objectively the optimal approach to the design. It's just a pretty optimal approach to the design that is something you would mod in. It is not the default one the game offers. This is another quick example. In Risk of Rain 2, when your allies die, they're dead until you beat the boss of the stage and go to the next stage. You can mod in ways to revive your allies, but if you do that, allies become very overpowered. So one of the ways I modded in is that you activate a shrine, a tombstone-like thing, an obelisk, on your allies to revive them. This is an objective you have to defend that spawns way more enemies and reduces your health while you're near it, and it's a risk. You then consider not reviving your allies, even though you can, because it's dangerous to revive them. Or you consider trying to pull off a bit of a coup and revive them and get their help killing the boss or whatever it is. And that creates an interesting push and pull that isn't there previously, where when your allies die, you just kind of go and you've made that decision. Now, you can probably see where this is going. Is reviving allies, even if it has some gameplay push and pull, better? That sounds like an interesting gameplay dynamic where you choose whether it's worth the risk to pull off reviving your allies. But is that better than having no choice in the matter? Well, no. I mean, the game is sort of about things just flowing. You get random items in each chest. You don't stop to make a decision between 3 items. Those little micro decisions, you don't choose whether to revive your ally. Removing all those micro decisions could remove some friction for a lot of players. But I think Risk of Rain 2 is boring when there aren't those decisions. So mostly preserving the game's gameplay essence, but then adding little decision points at these places where the game could have offered them but chose not to, does create basically the same game design, but just a different version of it, which is really interesting. That's a very valuable... I really, really like that Risk of Rain 2 mod build. We're going to do a whole thing about that at some point. That was a very educational experience for me about modding and game design. And I really do think that doing some modding or fiddling with your tabletop role-playing game rules a little is a really good form of like light game design. If you enjoy this type of discussion, I heavily encourage you to try doing those things. Just a little bit. That's also, I think, a valuable thing or important. I think a lot of people, mostly with homebrew for tabletop role-playing games, go a little far and add a bunch of stuff they think would be cool, but which doesn't actually serve a design goal. Likewise, with Risk of Rain 2, I think you'd want to wait until you play and think, yeah, I do want control over the items I get a little more. Or, yeah, I do want to be able to choose to revive my friends. Like, is that something that's coming up, or are you having a smooth experience without that? There's a reason the designers didn't put these things in. It's not hard to put these things into their game. Modders were able to do it very easily, by literally just turning up the weight of multi-shops to 100% or whatever in the game's backend, right? That one is super simple. It's very easy to do these things. So if the designers thought they were good, they would have put them in. They think there is a good experience to be had where you do not have those options. And I think they're completely correct. I think there's a sensible way of playing the game that some significant proportion of people would like more. Whether it's the most people, the majority, or not, we can never know. But I think they're correct that some large amount of the audience would prefer it the way it is. And I think I'm also correct that some large amount of the audience would prefer it this way I'm suggesting, where it's pretty much the same game essence, but you add these little micro decision points throughout the run. I think that's something a lot of people would really enjoy, and having a middle ground where you don't really make a build, but there are lots of little forks in the road, tiny little forks in the run, does make the game a more skill-intensive experience in a way, a tactical way that some people would like, and without really being a different game, in other words. And it's surprising how not that much more powerful this makes the player. Just we're not really going to get into it, but just as an aside. Anyway, but I think that's worth considering. I do think it's good to do it to solve a problem. That's all I was trying to say. It can be very fun to freely mod games like this, but I think it's valuable to do it when you have noticed it would be more fun to do, rather than doing it preemptively. I think it is good to have a little initial faith in the game designer. While a lot of this parlay, and indeed most of my videos on my channels, is about not holding the game designer too sacred, I think that's a bad thing that most people do. They kind of treat it like the game designer is a professional, so of course they have a good reason for doing it this way. Like, they often don't, and that's not bad. They have a limited timeline and a limited game development budget. Of course they don't have a good reason for many of the things they choose to do. They didn't have time to have a good reason for many of the things that they did. But it is good to have a good reason for all of the things in the game. That's just a very difficult thing to do. And people who say that's good aren't magically elevated beings that are perfectly propagated in every single moment of their life and embody this ideal like some kind of elemental. I don't perfectly do this in every waking moment, word and deed, of course. But I don't think it would be bad to do that as long as you remained flexible. And so I do still think it's reasonable to say, maybe games could do that more. Maybe that's good. Often, if you are propagating a design decision in the game as a whole, I think that will frequently be a good change to a game. So for an incredibly broad rule of thumb that I'm sure will be taken out of context and become a terrible piece of advice, there you are. I think we've done our job very well. Good job, folks. These were, as usual, very good examples, but I liked that there was kind of a gradient or a variety of them, too. That's not bad. Again, while I would have explained it better if I could have, don't get me wrong, I think it turned out well that I had an open-ended explanation and you all gave like different kinds of responses. You love to see it. Thanks for your support. Thanks for supporting Crew Parlay. This perk was designed because I have a lot of patrons and a lot of people through Twitch. Twitch subscribers get this tier too. I have a lot of people at that tier, at that $5 tier. Even though full-length Parlay is $9, giving people access to this, or like people with Parlay can all do a Parlay together too, that itself is cool. But also there are a lot of people that are just at the $5 tier. And I wanted to give you all something without it just being way too much work for me to keep up with. You know, I don't think I could easily do mini Parlay for every person at this tier, but that's kind of what I want to do, I thought to myself, and that's why Crew Parlay came about. It's kind of a way to do mini parlays for everybody that are united under a subject so I can go through them in a timely manner. So thank you for supporting the channels properly, me. Thank you for giving me money to do this thing I'm doing to entertain you, and thank you for the excellent responses, as always. Folks, the prompt for the next month is up, so if a lot of you are at this tier already, please feel free to respond to it if you want to. I'll read it to you now. It says, what intellectual property makes a good game? This could be an existing specific thing you think would be cool to adapt into a game, and why you think that would go well. Or you could take it in a more abstract direction and say what qualities you think make ideas good candidates for gamification. So again, this is what intellectual property would make a good game, or what type of intellectual properties might make good games. Hopefully one that people will have a ton of responses for, because I'm sure this is one of those ones where you know one already. You have one. I have something I really want. In many cases, the people who have the rights to the IP have even said what they think about it becoming a game. So I'm fascinated to hear the responses to this one. And of course, if you don't currently have Crew Parlay, not to advertise to you too much, a lot of you, the majority of people listening, probably already have Crew Parlay. But if you have it, you have time to get it and still respond to this. Were you to sign up like right at the end of the month, I would give you a few days of leeway to answer as well. So don't worry about it. And if you are anyway, just message me on Discord and I'll help you out. We'd love to have you. The more the merrier. So folks, if you have access to Crew Parlay, please respond to that prompt. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say and talking about your responses. Looking forward to the next one.